Welcome to the Craftsman Founder Podcast, hosted by Lucas Carlson. Every week, we talk to founders, entrepreneurs, and those who've made a craft out of creating companies and enterprises. Listen every week to get ideas for starting, promoting, and growing your business. There are no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work and craft. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's interview.
Hello, this is Lucas Carlson from the Craftsman Founder Podcast. This week, I am truly honored to have as my guest Ryan Holiday, who I have been following for many years. In fact, he has helped me with marketing my first novel, The Term Sheet, and he has written some awesome books himself. My favorite marketing book that I've read in the last 10 years is Trust Me, I'm Lying, is Ryan Holiday's memoir about his experience with American Apparel and learning about all of marketing. And I think it's genius. It really transformed the way I thought about marketing. And since then, he's been writing some really deep philosophical books. The Obstacle is the Way was his first in that Stoic line of books. And his new book just came out, Ego is the Enemy. And I got a nice little copy here, which I very much enjoyed. And so we're going to be talking about some of those topics today. And so, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you, man.
So this book is absolutely full of really insightful stories, people's lives, people's successes, people's failures. I was wondering, would it be okay if we talked about just a few of my favorites before we get into some of the bigger, deeper questions?
Of course, man. We can talk about whatever you want. It's your show.
One of my favorite examples was the DeLorean example. Would you be able to tell our audience a little bit about DeLorean? Because I knew about the cars, obviously. Everyone knows the cars. But I didn't know about the history of the man behind the DeLorean. I knew it was a failure of a car. Tell us a little more.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a contrarian, so I always try to look at the people that everyone likes or sort of holds up uncritically, and I try to figure out what's really going on. And I think the DeLorean is such a fascinating car and story because you have a car that sort of is popular despite itself. Like, it's notoriously a horrible car. It failed as a company. You know, he had a number of legal issues, but then his sort of reputation is of this sort of business maverick that, like, you know, the man tried to hold down. And so I wanted to figure it out. And, you know, when you look at DeLorean's life, what you find is a guy that basically had every opportunity, every shot, was intellectually and brilliantly gifted, and yet it didn't work. And what you find is that it mostly failed out of his tremendous ego and lack of discipline, right? So he starts the DeLorean Motor Company basically after sort of making his way through the ranks at GM, but sort of never following the rules, sort of feeling like he was stifled by this bureaucracy, which he probably was. And yet, when he goes to start DeLorean, where now he's in charge, it doesn't work out like he thought. Like, the cars come in late. They're notoriously poorly made. He hadn't secured the dealers that he needed. He didn't have the staff that he needed. Basically, one of his employees described his management style as sort of chasing colored balloons. Right, he's just racing from one thing to the next. He had all these side projects in the work. He sort of ran his company as his sort of personal fiefdom rather than an organization that was designed to succeed. And of course, it didn't succeed. And the only reason it really even had a shot at succeeding was he was such a brilliant marketer. And he kind of thought that hype and attention would compensate for this disorganization, which it never does. And I think the final sort of twist of the DeLorean story, which is so interesting to me, is after instead of as the wheels began to come off, you know, almost literally so, the cars, instead of saying, hey, I've got to get serious, it's time to grow up, DeLorean fastens on the idea of raising money through an illicit cocaine transaction, which he's immediately caught because it's actually an FBI sting. And, he's later acquitted. There was some elements of entrapment involved. But there's a video of the guy holding up a bag of cocaine being like, this is amazing. And so I just saw him as so often the mavericks and controversial personalities that we hold up as being like bold and visionary and genius were actually just assholes. And they deserved to fail because they didn't do the work that success really requires.
And you didn't cover Elon Musk at all, but I thought Elon Musk is like a modern DeLorean, except what would you say is different? How would you say he's different?
I don't know Elon, and I think it's probably too soon to tell about any of this. And right now, it seems like he's got quite a bit. It's all working, and so Elon Musk is actually I talk about Howard Hughes in the book a lot, who I think is a very similar character to DeLorean. The book the first book that I used to explore Howard Hughes, I'd actually read an interview with Elon Musk where he was saying that Howard Hughes is a cautionary tale and that he'd studied Howard Hughes to sort of learn what not to do. And so for me, as an outsider, perhaps Elon Musk has done the work and is sort of got the sort of moral and personal foundation required to. There's a quote in the book from J.M. Brasford. He's saying, it's hard to bear the fortunes of good success suitably, or some version of that. And I think that's true. And perhaps Elon Musk has done the work that he can deal with that immense amount of power and temptation and stress, or he's a ticking time bomb. We really don't know.
Totally makes sense. Why did you write this book? I love the story. You have it in here, but what is the impetus behind it?
There's many impetuses for a book. I think it's impetuses is the word, but there's many. There's a quote from Orwell. He says, writing a book is so horrible. If one wasn't driven by a demon, you would never make your way all the way through it. And so I identified it's not only one demon, you need like a lot, right? You need like many different motivations, or you're just going to quit at some point because quitting is always easier. So look, a big part of it was, my last book is about external obstacles. And I wanted to sort of talk about what I think is the biggest internal obstacle, which is ego. And that's what originally set me down the path. But then, I was the director of marketing. I was the director of marketing in American Apparel for a long time. And, I watched that company implode, and I was involved in trying to hopefully save it from itself. And that didn't work out. And that was sort of an insight to me on the very real personal cost of ego, right? Watching someone, evaporate hundreds of millions of dollars of their own wealth, watching that ripple through to all the employees and shareholders and stakeholders and hardworking people inside that company, watching how, sort of the lives that it ruined. That was a big part of it. And, I had some other relationships implode around that time. And so it was just, you have an idea for a book, and then life sort of shows you whether it's the right time or not. And there was a year there for me where I just was sort of seeing ego everywhere, not just in other people, but in myself. And so I said, this is what I want my next book to be.
That makes sense. It's so common these days to quote Steve Jobs or want to be like Steve Jobs. And to me, one of the most poignant lines in your book was the Don Charney quote when you were talking to him after his, as things were imploding. Would you share that little anecdote?
Yeah, so he called me right after he'd been fired by the board, and he was, deciding whether he was going to fight it or start another company. And I remember I asked him, I said, Dov, what are you going to do? Are you going to start another company? Are you going to be like Steve Jobs? And he said, Ryan, Steve Jobs died. and it's funny, but it's also so sad because it doesn't make any sense. And I knew that he meant it, but I don't think he knew what it meant. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And that's something I've seen a number of times with people is like, and I've been there myself, you work yourself into this corner where you're just not, you're barely even human anymore. You're just a cornered animal, just reacting and acting and reacting, and it's this terrible feedback loop. And so, you see something like that, and you're just, especially when it's someone that you looked up to, that you admired, that had mentored you, and you're like, is that going to happen to me? Is that the path that I'm on? And so you ask yourself some tough questions, and tough questions are a good thing to ask yourself when you're writing a book.
Well, that leads into a great question, which is, let's say you've had a lot of personal success in your life, but let's say you hadn't yet broken out. You hadn't been noticed. Okay. You hadn't yet been successful. You haven't started a company. You're not out there, but you really, really want to. And how can you tell the difference between ego and confidence? How can people tell you that you should be confident and you should just go out there, fake it till you make it. But then where's the line? Because that's a very vague line.
I'm not sure how vague it is. So I hate the phrase "fake it till you make it." Like, I mean, it's like, would you want your doctor to fake it till he makes it, or anyone who anything important rested on? Would you? The problem is that so many of us in this sort of service economy do non-essential things, right? So it's like, I guess you can fake it till you make it if you're self-publishing books, because 0 people are going to read them, so it doesn't really matter, right? Or if you're an internet marketing guru, which like isn't a real thing, if you're faking it till you make it, like faking it and making it are the same thing, because they're both nothing, So I think you can get away with that in ways that more essential tasks cannot. So I think it's a bad standard. But I would say confidence, and I talk about this in the book, confidence is earned, right? Confidence is based on what is real, what work that you have done, effort that you have put in, feedback that you have gotten, accomplishments that you've made. And ego is Donald Trump walking around thinking that he's qualified to be president because he decided he's qualified to be president. Confidence is, hey, I've studied this more than anyone. I've done the work. I've done more work than anyone. I've got the approval and the imprimatur of the people who are also experts of these things. And so I'm confident that I'm up to the task, and I'm confident that I will learn whatever I don't currently know, right? I think those are fundamentally different ways of interacting with the world.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that speaks to one of the biggest problems around entrepreneurship that I see is this idea that a great idea is pretty much all you need to have a startup. And that so many entrepreneurs I know come to me and say, my biggest problem, I need funding. I need to get venture capital. And I'm like, okay, well, what have you done to deserve that? Tell me about your story.
Sure.
And so oftentimes they've gotten nowhere except they have this brilliant idea that hasn't taken off, that nobody is interested, no customers. And I think that speaks to what you were just saying. The ego is believing in yourself without any fundamental objective reason.
Yeah, look, I was talking to an author yesterday, and I was sort of walking him through the sort of fundamentals of crafting a book and marketing and all this stuff. His cover wasn't great, and the title wasn't great, and all these things. He didn't have any reviews for it. All this sort of basic stuff, and he kept going, yeah, but where's the biggest platform that I can get this in front of people? And he kept doing that over and over again. He'd be like, yeah, I get that, and it's like, you don't get that, or you would have done it, and we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? And I think at one point I was like, you're yeah-ing over one of the hardest things to do in the world. You know what I mean? What are you talking about? You don't know this. I barely know it, and I'm on my 4th book, right? So this thing is, it's like when I start to see those signs, and this is partly what motivated me to write this book, is like I can more or less give you the odds on this person's chances of succeeding, and they're very bad, right?
Yeah.
Like I know that, and I also know, and this is the other thing, if he is successful, it will be an accident, right? And so oftentimes what we'll see egotistical people who are successful. You look at a Donald Trump or whatever, and you go, oh, well, that must work. And it's like, no, that's the opposite. This person is successful despite the fact, they've taken an enormous risk that just hasn't cost them anything yet. And that's hard for people to understand because we so desperately want shortcuts and we so desperately want the easy things.
And how do you manage that? So if you are in a point where maybe you realize that maybe you're more ego than confidence, what do you do about it?
Well, you got to find some way to get your ass kicked, right? So something to humble you, I guess. If you can't just relinquish this thing, you've got to find, like, one of the ways that you do it is you put yourself in things where you're in way over your head, right? One of the great things about sort of having a mentor or an advisor, like working for someone who's incredibly talented, is that every day you interact with someone whose shadow, you will never escape, and that knocks you down. You have someone who's holding you to a standard that you wouldn't dream of holding yourself to. That was very important for me when I was Robert Greene's research assistant. It's like I would turn something in and I'd be like, this is amazing. He's going to be so happy I did this amazing job. I'm the best. This is why he picked me. The narrative that's running through your head. And then he's like, there's nothing for me usable here. Like, why'd you waste your time? Not that he was a jerk at all, because he was incredibly nice. He would try to do it without hurting my feelings. But, is working with someone who's a master at their craft is just inevitably going to knock the wind out of your sails over and over and over again because they just know more than you can dream of.
What if you live in Africa and you don't have direct access to somebody that's like that?
Look, I mean, I pick up books all the time and I read them and I'm like, holy shit, this person is just on an entirely different level than me. Like, this is amazing. How is a human being capable of this? I work so hard and I'm 1% of this, right? So it's also just immersing yourself in the great tradition of brilliant thinkers or, practitioners of whatever it is that you're doing.
That makes sense. Do you have any books that have inspired you recently that you'd recommend?
So one of my favorite authors is Rich Cohen. He's like amazing. And every time I read one of his things, I'm like, holy shit, like how is a human being capable of this?
And you also have a website that gives you monthly recommendations, right?
I do. And that's part of it. I'm always trying to read stuff that's better than what I can do.
Yeah, I think that for me personally, one of my biggest mistakes when I was running my startup was telling myself the false story that I was far too busy to read.
Sure.
And I got through it. My company was acquired, and I found myself with all this free time, and I was like, well, it's better. I better catch up on my reading. And in the process of reading, I was like, I cannot believe I stopped reading while doing my company. Like, I can't believe I gave myself such a fickle excuse.
Yeah, no, you gotta see it as part of your job.
Yep.
Because it is part of your job. Your job is to learn and know.
And that's, I think, also one thing that comes out in your book that's really, really well said is one of the other things that DeLorean focused on so much were all of the details, and you compared it against Eisenhower. So tell our audience, how did Eisenhower contrast to DeLorean's micromanaging attitude?
Well, look, it's very flattering to become obsessed with the sort of micromanaging details. You know what I mean? To make yourself sort of essential to every minor little thing, but you can't do that if you want. Like I'll give you an example. So let's say you run a company or you have some task. You might fancy yourself really fucking good at that thing. And you probably are really good at that thing. Now, the problem is as your company scales and as you become more successful, you're going to have to let other people work on that thing also, right? And so delegation is inherently ego challenging because you have to say, this person is not me. They're a separate person. They are going to do this task. I'm going to have to accept how they do that task. And I'm going to have to tolerate that it might not be as good as how I would personally do it because there's other more important things that I need to work on. And so that prioritization and that, relinquishing of control and power is really hard for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that that I read a few years ago was about how Warren Buffett spends a huge portion of his time reading, and how interesting that was. That somebody who everybody thinks is the best investor in the world, really influential, really powerful. You'd think, oh, he's probably meeting people. He's flying everywhere. He's going to meetings. He's such an important person, and yet he dedicates himself. I might be misquoting here, but I remember it's something like 70% of his time he spends just reading, and I found that stunning.
Bill Gates goes on these think weeks where he just takes like 2 weeks off and he just thinks and reads. And the idea of like, hey, there's a line I have in the book about Eisenhower and one of his assistants, and he's like, Ike does the most important things. I do the next most important things. And oftentimes being creative and thinking and having big ideas, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I tell this to the entrepreneurs that I advise. If you're not spending time alone thinking about the bigger picture, who is?
No, that's exactly right. Like if you think about how a traditional company works, right? The board of directors has to think biggest picture. The CEO has to think second biggest picture. And then as it goes down the hierarchy, the person is getting less and less big picture. So it's like, if you're the CEO, I remember one time I looked out my office and Dove, who's the founder of American Apparel, was like directing traffic in the parking lot. Like there had been some, it wasn't working right. And he thought and it's like, he almost, because he's so smart, he almost certainly was making things better. It was like improving things. But it was the exact opposite of what the CEO of a company that did $700 million a year in sales and had 12,000 employees. It's the exact opposite of how he should be spending his time.
Yeah. What do you think of when somebody says, I'm so busy, I don't have time to do anything like this that you're talking about. I'm just so busy.
I mean, like when I personally hear people say I'm so busy, I normally, what you should hear when you hear those words is, I don't want to do that, right? Like, there's almost nothing that you're literally too busy for because you would just change your plans to do that thing, right? So when you hear someone say I'm too busy, they're saying that's not a priority to me.
Yep, makes sense. And if you're telling yourself that you're too busy to spend time thinking, like
you're sending the same message. You're saying I'm claiming that thing is important to me, but it's clearly not.
How do you feel about millennials and their, often labeled as an entitled generation? How do you feel about that?
I don't feel like a millennial, right? Because I read all these things about how millennials are, and it sort of doesn't match my experience. That also, I'm either very much the exception or the labels are totally wrong. I don't know. I mean, I do feel like this has been a generation that's been relatively slow to get going. Like I think part of that's the economic crisis. I think part of that's a sort of sense of entitlement and maybe naivete about the reality of the world. But I don't know, man. I think generational labels are for the most part like totally unhelpful. And when I hear people spending a lot of time on generational labels or personality tests or all these things, I just think this is someone who lives in theory and not in reality.
Totally agree with you on that. I'm curious, do you think if DeLorean, if this book could have been sent back in time, do you think DeLorean would have picked it up?
Through a DeLorean? Yeah, I don't know. I've certainly met a lot of people like him. I mean, that's something sort of my company does, is we tend to find ourselves, hired by some successful person who's trying to launch something, or they're in some publicity crisis. And it's like a problem completely of their own making. And it's this sort of delicate dance to get them to understand the true facts of whatever the situation they're in. And sometimes you have success because the person is actually, at a place where they're open and receptive to change. But so often, I think what'll be interesting is there will be people that I know are very egotistical, like friends of mine or colleagues or whatever. They will read this book and totally agree and think it applies to other people, right? And that's the insidious part of ego, is that it often gives you an immense amount of insight into other people, but prevents you from seeing how those exact same criticisms apply to you. And that's the hard part, right? The hard part is, it's easy to point out somebody else's flaw. There's that biblical verse, it's easy to point out the splinter in someone else's eye with, ignoring the log in your own. And I think that's something I struggle with too. You don't write a book about ego and not have a bit of your own as well, so I understand that it's complicated.
What's coming up for you? Are you going to be working on more philosophy books? Are you going to go into marketing books again, or what's next for Ryan Holiday?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, hopefully I'll write more books. I have, this one's been, 2+ years in the making, so I just sort of want to get it out. Yeah, I have another book that's coming out in October that will be a book of Stoic philosophy, a sort of a daily devotional, like passages of Stoic wisdom for every single day. And then I'll have another book in 2017 that I'm not really talking about yet, but that I'm pretty excited about as well. So I've got my next sort of smaller projects lined up, but my next big thing I haven't tackled, and I'm sort of deliberately not tackling. I want to take a bit of a breath before I do so.
And how did somebody that came being so well known from the marketing world turn into a guy writing this really deep philosophy stuff?
Well, first off, I don't think that anyone should have to ask permission to write or think or, be involved in any field or space that they want. So I sort of reject the idea that it's like, this is your lane, you have to stay in that lane. But, for me, I was actually writing about philosophy before my marketing book came out. So when that book came out, people were like, what is this? They didn't know that was my day job. They're like, so what is this? When are you going to write a philosophy book? Then that book came out, and all those fans, when my philosophy book came out, they were like, this is a surprise. And so I just sort of don't think about that. I just write what I'm interested in, or what I think would be, what I think would find an audience, So it's like, if you do, look, it's hard to go from one just sort of subject expertise to the other. But if you put in the work, I think people just care if the book is good and it helps them or not.
Makes sense. Well, I think that this book is very good, and I think it will help a lot of people. So thank you for writing it. And
amazing. Thanks, man.
Thanks for coming on the show. So if people want to sign up for your newsletter of book recommendations, where should they go?
RyanHoliday.net, and it should pop up, or you just click the reading list thing and a reading newsletter, and it now goes out to almost 60,000 people every month, and it's just the 4 or 5 books that I think are really good that are worth reading that month.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time on the show, and good luck with your future endeavors.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Craftsman Founder Podcast with Lucas Carlson. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, craftsmanfounder.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a Craftsman Founder production. Join us next time for another edition of the Craftsman Founder Podcast.